Hello again. Today we're going to answer a question on every JavaScript scold's mind. Is Node.js in decline? We have data all the way up to the end of 2018 to analyze, so we can see trends and we can analyze whether Node.js is still a going concern or whether people are moving on to better things. So let's jump into the data. Here we have download data for Node.js.org. This is downloads for all tarballs, installers, that you can get from Node.js.org, and it stretches all the way back to mid-2014, and I've cut it off at the end of 2018. As we can see from this chart, the answer to the question, is Node.js in decline, is probably no. There's no downward trend except for that dip at the end, which I'll talk about later. In fact, the trend line there doesn't even seem to match the recent data, so things are looking pretty healthy for Node. We'll dig into details about that, but the overall picture is fairly positive. I'll note here that this is smoothed with 7-day rolling average, and the reason for that is that Node has a very strong weekly trend. On the weekends it's low, and on the weekdays it's very high. So the original source data, if you look this up on nodejs.org, where you can find the source data, and I'll leave a link for that in the video description, but if you did this yourself without the averaging, you would have very spiky lines, which are a little bit hard to read. So I always apply a 7-day moving average to these. So let's dig in and see what we can learn about this data and address the question a little bit more in a little bit more sophisticated way. So what I've done here is split up the data into year groups. Now, instead of taking the full year, I've taken just November. So this is the average daily November downloads. Now, the reason for November is that it's the end of the year, but it's not December, which is a crazy year for download numbers. Things are really all over the place in December, particularly as we get to Christmas and then the end of the year. Things are just so unpredictable. Well, they're fairly predictable, but it's just not a good pattern. So November is pretty consistent. It's not October, where we do the big LTS release and the new current release. So it's a fairly stable time of year, and it's good for comparing. You could do this with other times of the year, but I've chosen November here just as a way to try and get some stability. What we can see, if we look at the green line, this is the average daily downloads for anything from Node.js.org, for any of the binaries or source tarballs, and you can see that there's an upward trend. So there was a bit of a dip between 2016 and 17, but it's still heading upward. And then in the top one, it's the year-on-year percentage growth. You can see in the beginning we were looking at over 200% growth. This is around the time of Node.js 4, when we formed the foundation. And I was doing the conference circuit around 2015-16, saying how Node's doubling in growth. And it was true at the time, but since then it's leveled out a bit more. So it's still growing, but it's not accelerating. It's not doubling every year. But you could see last year was actually a pretty good year for Node. We bucked the downward trend. So I'm not really sure what the difference between 17 and 18 is. I don't have a good explanation for that, but as we go on, I'll talk more about the numbers and what I know about it, and we can see what assumptions we can form. I find it more helpful to break this up into these reference points. These are very significant milestones for Node.js. Every October we cut a new LTS, and we'll see later on as I dig into the versions that they're very significant times in terms of download patterns. As I mentioned, this is with a 7-day moving average applied, and the spikes for weekdays versus weekends is very big. But if we were to unmask that and look for the peak here, we actually find it in October 30th, 2018, quite a way above the average line there, but that gives you an idea of how big the spikes can be. So that was 1.5 million downloads on October the 30th, and we've actually come close to beating that record in November and December as well. We've been right up there, so that should be broken again. Probably January. I haven't actually looked at January's numbers, but I would expect it to be broken January, February, and to keep on growing. So in this chart, what I've done is it's still the total downloads per day, but I've broken it up instead of years into LTS years. So this is basically from October to October. And I've included 0-10 here, approximately a year's worth of 0-10. And so these are the eras rather than, this is not how much each of these has been downloaded, it's how much was downloaded from the site during that time. So it's just an interesting way of breaking it down rather than doing it by year. But what we can see here, I'll turn my video off, is that Node 8, this is this last year that ended in October 2018. The trend line is significantly better than the others, which is really interesting. And it actually, the whole way through, it's quite a good trend line, whereas the others have this interesting dip. So not really sure what's going on there, but it could be to do with the number of releases around this time. But yeah, not really sure. I wouldn't read much into Node 10 at the moment. That only started in October, and currently it's following the same pattern as the rest of them. And it does have this dip, which happens at the end of the year. We'll see it more clearly later on. But that does happen anyway. It's bigger this year. I'm not sure why, but it's there. And it has picked up again. If you look at the January numbers, it has come back up again. So that's perfectly expected. It's just a bigger scale than we've had in the past. So what can we learn from this totals data? Well, as I said, it's still growing. It's at a reduced year-on-year rate. We can no longer say Node's doubling its downloads every year. But it's still greater than linear, so it's still got a mild acceleration, but it's closer to around 140% year on year. So I mean that's decent. Read into it what you will, but Node's certainly not in decline. Let's dig a bit deeper and look at Node by versions and see how the versions are doing, and there's some interesting lessons to learn in there. Again, this data is available on nodejs.org, link in the description of the video. You could do some work on it yourself. Now, this is all of the major versions of Node from 0.10 onward. There is still data for 0.6, 0.8. You can actually see all sorts of different versions in there, but I've trimmed out just the interesting ones to show you what's going on. Now, if you recall, we started LTS with Node 4, and then every second one has been an LTS release line after October. It's pretty obvious when you look at the data which ones are the LTS release lines. They are the ones that go bigger. And 0.10, we may as well call an LTS release line. It was around for so long and supported for such a long time. It displays the same characteristics as we've seen with the others. So following 0.10, we had 0.4, then 6 went higher, and then 8 went even higher. In between is interesting. The version 5, 7, 9, and 11, they never reach the same height. We don't recommend them on nodejs.org. It's like we tell people that LTS is the recommended one, and you should download the current one if you're wanting to try new things. They carry a little bit more risk, but also they end after 6 months, so they're just not as good a choice for most people. And you can see that reflected in the downloads. People pick up that message and then they decrease fairly rapidly. So, for instance, Node version 5 follows this downward path pretty quickly. It goes down to essentially nothing. And the other ones, Node version 7 is doing the same thing. And then even 9 is same path again. So they're essentially going to nothing. It's interesting to note what is happening with Node version 10x. If in the last year you can see it's pretty much a straight line, which is fascinating. And Node version 0.12 peters out to nothing. So 0.12 is at essentially the same numbers as Node version 5 now. And you know, my contention at the time was Node version 0.12 was dead on release. It was a catch-up release because we were doing IO.js at the time. It wasn't a very good quality release. There was quality problems all the way through. I think it was done too quickly. I think there was too much planned for it, and then it was released in a hurry. That's my theory about it. And people saw what was going on and either stuck with Node 0.10 or waited for Node 4, which came out fairly soon afterwards. That was a turmoil time around that period when we were doing IO.js. Yeah. Anyway, that's all history now because this stuff on the right-hand side is a long way from that time in the past. So let's not analyze the past too much, I suppose. In this view, I have trimmed it to just the modern LTS lines, and we've trimmed it to the end of 2015. So just the lifetime of Node 4. And this shows some really interesting things about the way that the bulk of users are using Node and then switching between versions and adhering to the LTS periods. Firstly, if we look at the dates when the LTS was declared, we can see some interesting patterns. So Node version 4, you can't read too much into anything that was going on early this time because it was so new and we were dealing with IOJS and Node 0.10 and 0.12. So and also the lead up to Node version 4 LTS was only, I think, 2 months, whereas the rest of them we've given a 6-month lead up. So this is when we've called it current, the 6 months before LTS for Node version 6, 7, 6, 8, and 10. So in terms of adoption of LTS release lines, there's a really interesting pattern that happens. So when we declared Node 6 to be the new LTS, we had a switch over of the most popular version almost immediately. People hopped on the new version, which was fantastic news. We were wondering what people would do, whether people would listen to that and set up their processes to be able to migrate. And that was the stability strategy that we came up with under the foundation, to strictly adhere to SEMVer, to break as little as possible, to communicate really well, and to have regular releases that built trust. So people built up a large amount of trust. There was a lot of trauma migrating to Node 4. That was difficult for people. But since then, the transitions from major versions have been really simple. And Node has been, particularly the LTS versions, have been very solid. And we've built a lot of trust. So this pattern, I think, reflects that trust. When we get to the switch over between to Node 8 LTS, and recall here that we don't drop an LTS when we switch them over. We keep on supporting it. So Node 4 only dropped support relatively recently. Actually, I don't remember the dates, but Node 6 is about to lose support as well. So you have a long period to migrate, but we encourage people to do it as soon as possible. So the crossover pattern point for Node 6 to 8 occurred much later than it did for the other version, for 4 to 6. I think the data so far, it is hard to extrapolate from this, but I think it's pointing to perhaps an even more delayed switch over. So I'm not sure what that means exactly. Maybe it's to do with people not feeling the necessity like in the beginning. Maybe we set a tone for urgency, and now it's, well, this thing's going to be supported for a lot longer, so let it go. Or it could be the nature of businesses that are adopting it, because enterprise in particular is very slow to upgrade. We always knew that. And as Node has gone on, we've had more and more enterprise adoption. And so what we could be seeing here is the difficulty in enterprise environments of upgrading. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the crossover from 8 to 10. It certainly hasn't happened already, and it's not going to happen in the January data. I haven't looked for the crossover point there, but I'm pretty sure it hasn't happened. So that's an interesting pattern. I have put a note in here that this spike in the middle of 2017 for Node 6 is a discountable anomaly. We can actually make that completely disappear and turn into a normal smooth line there if we remove a couple of IP addresses that from a single large company that had a rogue server trying to download Node 6 every day. A lot, so it's possible to remove that. I haven't done these numbers, but don't read anything into that because it's a discountable anomaly. Next, we have some peaks. This is the peak download numbers for any single version. These have to happen late in the cycle because when we declare a new LTS, you're basically waiting for a transition between old and new. So we won't see a peak for 10 until later in the cycle, probably later this year, in I would say October, like it has happened for the rest of them. So Node 4 peaked at 277,000 downloads in 2016, and then we went up to nearly 500,000 downloads for Node 6, again in the September-October range. And then the record for any single version downloaded was Node 8. It happened on October the 23rd, and it was approximately 900,000 downloads in a single day. That was the same day as Node 11 came out, just 11.00, and also Node 10.11.0, which was 2 versions before LTS, which is surprising to me that we would reach a peak on the same day as we had 2 additional releases out. That was the peak for Node 8. It'll be very interesting to see what the number is for Node 10. So just in summary, some things we can learn just from that data. LTS release lines are significantly more popular than non-LTS release lines. That's by design, and it has worked out that way. A lot of people like to get on the new shiny stuff, which is completely understandable. But they do recognize the 6-month support timeframe for the current releases, the non-LTS ones, is very restrictive and quite risky. So that's great. Non-LTS release lines have a rapid drop at 6 months, as we saw in that data. They are actually supported technically for about 8 months, but that's only if there were security releases. Pretty much they get dropped on the floor by the open source team at the 6-month point when a new one comes out. And then we see this the gradual decay towards 0. Users are switching to new LTS lines fairly quickly after October. However, there may be a trend for a longer delay each year. So we'll see what happens later this year for Node version 10. It'll be very fascinating to see what we can read into that. Node 0.12 exhibits similar behavior to a non-LTS line. So it's like current. It's as I said, the numbers are very much like version 5. They're basically down to just a trickle. Node 0.10 is fascinating. I'm calling it our Internet Explorer 6. We saw this when, if you were around developing websites around the 2000s, or maybe it was later than that. IE6 was just the browser that didn't go away. You had to keep on testing for it, even though it wasn't actively shipped anymore. And for whatever reason, my theory was always that it was the reason that it showed up a lot was because people were using it to test. And that's my theory about Node 0.10, is that what we see is probably a lot of downloads by CI systems like Travis, where people have open source projects still testing 0.10. So every time there's a Travis run, they have to download from Node.js.org, and that adds somewhere. I think it's in the range of around 10%, 10 to 15% is CI systems like Travis and AppVeyor do downloading from Node.js.org. So if you remove that, you might see Node 0.10 being much smaller. But Node 0.12 has been pretty much ignored, unlike 0.10. And that's about it for the data I have for the Node.js.org downloads. I would say that you would get some interesting and different numbers from NPM, and you can follow Laurie Voss on Twitter. I think he's still putting out occasional charts with their their user usage details. It shows a different pattern. They get to look at what people are doing with Node every day, how much they're downloading packages and interacting with NPM. I would say that data would add an interesting picture to this when combined. Unfortunately, my caution for that is that NPM, they have a commercial imperative to put a fairly positive spin on the data. So I wouldn't expect full transparency with the data there. So, take it for what it is. But, certainly I wouldn't expect it to be discouraging data anyway. So that's it for today. Let me know if you like this video, and I always like looking at metrics. This fascinates me all the time. So if you like this kind of content, let me know, and I might be able to produce more of it. Thank you.